A winter morning, a dog. A letter. One cold winter morning along the fog-covered riverbank, people discovered a collapsed Malinois dog, its body battered patches of dried blood, clinging to matted fur. But what struck them most was this. The dog was still clenching a crumpled, soaked piece of paper in its mouth, as if it had lived for one reason, only to protect that scrap. Let's begin the story. Winter had come late to the northern outskirts of Winslow. Snow had yet to fall, but the chill had already seeped into the bones by mid-November. The Delmore River, usually calm and gentle year-round, was that morning wrapped in such a dense fog it seemed like the water had vanished, replaced by a thick, ghostly white mist rising from the earth. The sky hung heavy and low, almost collapsing onto the horizon, making everything feel unusually small and still. Marcus Reed, a 67-year-old widower living alone in a wooden cabin less than 100 steps from the riverbank, came out early like he always did. His old fishing rod, a rusted folding chair, and a jar of earthworms had been his most faithful companions since his wife passed. To Marcus, the river's edge was peace, a place untouched by the noise of a world that moved faster than he ever could. But that morning, he didn't cast a single line. He stood frozen. A crumpled body lay under the drooping branches of a willow tree near a bend in the river, where the water had eroded a soft hollow into the bank like it had been blown there by the wind. A dog, emaciated, curled up, trembling in the small aftershocks of pain that had gone on too long. Its once brown and black coat clung to its frame in clumps soaked with dried blood, mud, and torn skin. It didn't bark, didn't move, just lay there still clutching something that looked like a wet piece of paper in its jaws. At first, Marcus thought it was already dead, but as he stepped closer, one of its drooping ears twitched and a low, raspy growl rumbled from its throat, not threatening, but more like a voiceless plea. "Don't take it." Marcus stepped back, heart pounding. He wasn't afraid of dogs, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just the wounds or the state it was in. It was how it gripped that scrap of paper as its life depended on it. He called the local animal rescue first, then the police, because this, he realized, wasn't just a case of an abandoned animal. There was something deeply human in how this creature held on to that object, as if it knew if it dropped it, nothing would matter anymore. When the rescue team arrived, they used rubber gloves and mild sedatives to get close. Even in its weakened state, the dog bit down so hard on that piece of paper that its gums began to bleed. No one understood why, but everyone fell silent when the first veterinarian gently pulled the grimy, wrinkled, half-dissolved paper from its jaws and unfolded it. On the paper was a line of handwriting, shaky but legible, written in smudged black ink. "If you're reading this letter, I'm sorry I didn't make it home, but I wasn't alone. Shadow was here, and I kept fighting. Don't cry for me, because I lived with purpose, no name, no address, just a signature, 3 simple curves. EC local authorities opened the case files." Meanwhile, one of the rescue team members casually posted a photo of the dog and the letter on social media as a somber winter tale. No one expected what would follow. Within hours, the photo had gone viral across veteran forums and military groups. In it, the dog lay on wet mud, turned slightly to the side, eyes closed. The letter still clutched in its jaws, set against a misty sky like a post-war scene pulled from a forgotten film reel. People began calling it names: the last soldier, the surviving soul, the keeper of the letter. And within that same span of hours, the image reached the hands of someone long overlooked by the world Sergeant Michael Trask, a retired veteran who once served at the southern border, 91st Battalion. He stared at the photo for a long time, then slowly stood trembling and walked to an old filing cabinet. He pulled out a weathered folder. Inside was an old photo, a young soldier cradling a Malinois, In the background stood a military outpost, beneath it typed Ethan Callahan and Shadow. K9 unit. Trask whispered, "It can't be. But if it is, then you've walked over 300 miles just to bring back one letter." The letter was sealed in a sterile plastic sleeve and laid gently on a stainless steel table under forensic lab lights. The ink had bled. The paper was soft with water damage. But the handwriting endured shaky yet filled with resolve. Each word seemed etched with the last remaining fragments of its writer, a trace of strength, a sliver of hope, and a mountain of goodbye. Line by line, the words appeared again, unshaken even through a faint bloodstain at the bottom corner. I'm sorry. If you're reading this, I probably didn't make it home, but I wasn't alone. Shadow was here, and I was still fighting. Don't cry for me because I lived, right? If someone finds this letter, please help bring it home. Ethan Callahan. No one spoke for several long minutes. While the handwriting analysis team began matching samples, the only man standing outside the examination room, Sergeant Michael Trask, didn't need confirmation. He already knew. He had read hundreds of lines in the same hand, across field journals, terrain maps, and half-torn letters sent back to base. It was always the same crooked, steady script of Ethan Callahan, the youngest soldier in the Border Response Unit, whose military report had declared missing in action. Presumed dead remains unrecoverable. And yet the letter had made it back. Even stranger, it hadn't been found in a backpack, a foxhole, or a ruined outpost. It had been carried home by something no one expected to survive. A dog named Shadow, Ethan's four-legged partner, trained to fight and fall alongside him on every mission. Shadow was a purebred Malinois ID number 93K9. Once considered an elite specimen with combat reflexes and navigational memory well above standard. Within the unit, Ethan never left his side. They were so in sync that no commands were needed. Just a tilt of the head, a shift in breathing, and they understood each other. The soldiers used to joke, "Ethan doesn't wear a watch. Shadow is his living compass." 7 months ago, during an engagement, the unit was split. Soldiers were killed and wounded, and the sparse reports concluded that Ethan and Shadow had likely gone down somewhere in the remote borderlands territory no one could return to without risking more lives. There was no funeral, no remains. It's just a silent memorial. And now somehow one half of that pair had returned, bruised, bloodied, but alive. And most incredibly, with the letter still intact in his mouth. Veterinary experts speculated that Shadow had carried the letter across hundreds of kilometers, perhaps over mountains, through forests, across borders, surviving on raw instinct. But paper is fragile. It tears. It dissolves. How could any dog, no matter how smart, keep a letter from falling, getting soaked, or being chewed apart over such a long journey? The question wasn't just how he survived. It was why he insisted on bringing that letter back. In the treatment room, Shadow had not yet regained consciousness. The medical team had shaved the matted, blood-soaked fur, stitched a gash along his side, and administered fever medication. His heartbeat was so weak, it needed mechanical support. But people noticed something strange even in his unconscious state. The muscles in his jaw were tense, as if his mouth still remembered holding something. Michael Trask stood in silence. Deep down, he knew what others merely found touching. This wasn't just an intelligent dog following orders. This was a soldier refusing to abandon his comrade. A creature given a mission would not let itself die until it was complete. And if the letter was the dying words of a soldier, then Shadow was its keeper. 7 months ago, the maps of the southern region near the Zorak border showed no official military activity. The blank spaces on the charts weren't empty. They were intentionally omitted. Missions conducted there left no records, no satellite images, and no formal condolences. If someone failed to return, Raven 9 was deployed to the region at the end of the dry season, where daytime heat could scorch the skin off your wrists and nighttime cold stabbed into your bones like needles. Orders were transmitted through encrypted frequencies: locate an illegal supply facility, suspected of trafficking heavy-grade military equipment, and erase all traces. No one mentioned prisoners, no one spoke of rescue. Everyone understood this was a one-way mission. Go deep, complete the objective, and withdraw without leaving a trace. Ethan Callahan, 27 at the time, was one of the youngest in the unit, but everyone knew he never operated alone. Shadow, a dark-coated Malinois K9, was his second pair of eyes, his lungs in battle and his reflexes in danger. They needed no verbal commands. A blink, a slight tug on the leash, Shadow understood instantly. In the squad, they weren't called a man and his dog. They were simply known as two beings, breathing the same mission. On the 6th day of the op, the unit moved into Jaguar Gorge, believed to house a weapons cache. Signs were clear: heat trails, human scent, scattered comm signals. Everything seemed on track, until the first boot touched the horseshoe-shaped ridge. That was when hell broke loose. They were ambushed from 3 sides. Bullets sliced the air like steel hooks. The wind wasn't from the weather. It was the sound of hundreds of rounds breaking the sound barrier. 3 men fell within the first 20 seconds. While dragging a wounded teammate to cover, Ethan was hit in the hip, the bullet tearing through level 3 armor and soaking his torso in blood. Shadow roared, eyes burning like embers, but Ethan gripped the leash. He wouldn't let him charge. The commander gave the retreat signal, 3 green flashes. Everyone knew that you wouldn't move again if you didn't move within the next 45 seconds, but Ethan couldn't go. He knew it. His leg couldn't carry him up the eroded slope behind. If someone tried to drag him, they'd all be too slow. Just a few seconds too slow, and they'd die. Ethan tore off his pack and reached for the small notebook always strapped to his hip, the one no one would touch. Inside was a letter he'd written on the first night at the front, never mailed, meant to be left behind if things went wrong. With blood-slicked fingers, he tore the page out, folded it 4 times and tied it inside a strip of medical cloth. Shadow sat beside him, eyes locked, breathing hard but not trembling. Ethan saw something he never had before in those eyes, waiting for one final order. He tied the cloth to Shadow's collar, then leaned in his lips near the dog's muzzle. No one heard what he said. No cameras, no microphone, just a moment of silence, then a single stroke across Shadow's head. And Shadow disappeared into the smoke against the wind alone, charging through the burning gorge lit by tracer fire. The retreat was chaos. No one looked back. No one dared ask if Ethan made it, because everyone knew a question. Like that would only lead to one answer: a kill report. The next day, Ethan Callahan's name was marked in red ink in the commander's handwritten log. Beside it, a single note missing in action, presumed dead Shadow. K9 2000. 3. Status unknown. No one knew that hundreds of kilometers from the border, the creature marked unknown was already moving, beginning a journey. No one had trained it for, guided only by the last words of a fallen comrade. Go home. Take it home. Shadow wasn't just carrying a letter. Inside that soaked, blood-stained, time-worn scrap of paper wasn't just a dying soldier's farewell. It also held something almost no one noticed: a faint, slanted coordinate written near the edge, blurred into the final lines. A string of numbers, not labeled on any official map, but well known to anyone who had ever stepped foot on that battlefield. An unauthorized supply post, suspected of hosting illegal weapons exchanges and banned tech components. Ethan Callahan, had been tasked with monitoring that outpost for several weeks before the ambush. And his death in some twisted way might not have been the result of war, but a cleanup operation. While carrying the letter, Shadow moved like a ghost through unnamed lands, avoiding main roads, staying low under moonless skies, navigating through raw instinct and fragmented memories from past missions. The letter, now buried deep in the frayed collar he wore, had become part of his body. Whenever he caught the scent of humans, the hum of unfamiliar engines, or the distant buzz of drones, he would freeze for hours, pressed flat to the ground, avoiding all light, including the moon. But by around day 9, something changed. It wasn't just instinct. It was a presence. Someone was following him. There was a scent, gunpowder mixed with oil, but it wasn't military. No uniforms, no insignia, no formation. The steps were too careful. The flashlight beams too faint, sweeping like searchers, but not for rescue. One night, as Shadow paused beside a dry ditch to rest, the first bullet grazed his flank. The sound was muffled, silenced, but the searing rip across his skin was real. He didn't howl, didn't panic. He rolled from the rock, tore through the underbrush, and vanished, just like his name. From that night on, it was no longer just a mission. It was a hunt. Shadow was no longer just injured. He was being hunted, and the men following him weren't sent to retrieve him. They were sent to erase him. They didn't care how long he'd survived. They didn't need evidence. They had one objective: stop the letter from reaching anyone still breathing. Once Shadow was cornered in an old abandoned market. The largest of the mercenaries found claw marks and a trail of blood on a cracked cement wall. But as he leaned in, Shadow dropped from the roof, sank his teeth deep into the man's shoulder, and vanished before the blade ever left its sheath. The bite went to the bone, and from that night on, that man never walked alone again. With each passing day, Shadow grew weaker. The bleeding slowed, but his heartbeat stayed steady, locked to a single rhythm: keep moving. Hold the letter, bring it home. He crossed a rock-choked ravine once used as a minefield. He remembered another K9 had died there. This time, Shadow crawled belly down, biting his muzzle to stop from whimpering as sharp stone pierced his gut. He encountered a pack of starving wolves at a forest junction, 2 adults in front, one still with baby fur. Under normal circumstances, he would have avoided them, but they blocked the only path with water. Shadow didn't run. He lowered his stance, let out a deep, slow growl, and leaped at the lead wolf. When the pack scattered, Shadow stayed behind, blood at his mouth, one ear torn, but the letter was still there, and so he kept going. Somewhere far away. No one knew the dog was still alive, but in the shadows, some understood a creature was crossing hell to keep a promise. A promise no one had heard, but strong enough to override every survival instinct it had. And if they couldn't stop it, the truth they buried would surface because of a single dog and a smudged piece of paper. Winter arrived earlier than anyone expected. Shadow made his way north from the dry southern hills, where soft soil hardened into rock. The trees thinned and shed their leaves, and the sky turned gray like the face of someone with nothing left to lose. The path he chose had no markings, no painted lines, just vague memories from a brain once trained to navigate without direction, now running on instinct and a final command: get the letter home. But the body was broken. Since the wolf encounter 3 days earlier, Shadow's right hind leg had fractured. He couldn't run, couldn't leap. Each step became a dragging pull, and every time his paw touched the ground, he gasped, grinding his teeth to hang on to what little strength remained. But even with a shattered leg, even with blood leaking from each movement, he never bit through the cloth that held the letter. He held it steady, unshaken. One night, the snow began to fall, not violently, not with biting wind, but with the cruelest no, silent, relentless, and erasing everything. The trail Shadow had just traveled vanished beneath a soft dusting of white covering every drop of blood, every trace of scent. Maybe that was the only reason the second hunting team missed him, but that same snow made him lose his way. Day 12 on the road. No water, no prey, no forest. Only wind, sharp as blades slashing across his face, and an endless white so blinding could drive a mind to madness. Shadow collapsed beside a dead pine tree, his breath weakening. The letter was still in his mouth. His eyes were wide open, glazed over with frost. To anyone passing by, he would have looked dead, but Ethan was still calling. Not in voice, not in the image, but in memory, a sunlit courtyard, a hand on his head each morning, that quiet laugh when he jumped into the truck, the loosened leash before each mission, and those final eyes, bloody and silent, just before Shadow was ordered to run. Not here, not yet. Shadow surged back to his feet like a machine jolted by its last power drop. He didn't bark, didn't howl, just trembled once, then moved. 3 legs, curved spine, head lowered, the torn cloth still clenched tightly between his jaws. On the night of day 14, he passed out again, the 3rd time in 2 days. But this time there was a sound. A train whistle, distant, faint, but real, not a hallucination. He rose, crawled, dragged his body through a broken wire fence until he reached an old railway, one of the freight routes that still ran cross-border at night. The lights didn't hit him, but the screech of wheels and the rumble in the ground were enough north that direction. The one Ethan once called home. By day 16, Shadow was little more than scars, dried blood, and mud. One ear was nearly torn off, deep claw marks across his back from a pack of feral dogs in a starving town. But they didn't get the letter. Shadow had bitten into his bleeding shoulder to keep the cloth from coming loose. A boy in that town, Kyle saw him first. He didn't approach, just stood from a distance, tossed him some bread, and then shakily pulled out his phone and took a photo. He posted it with a caption. A strange dog is dragging itself across the street, face covered in blood, but holding something that looks like a letter. No one dares go near, it looks like. A soldier. That photo within hours would reach places no one expected, and from it, the final reunion would begin. But for now, Shadow kept moving. Every time he was about to collapse, something pulled him back up, not food, not instinct, but a promise. A final order, and a figure waiting somewhere in the wind, in the snow, in memory. On the morning of day 17 since leaving the battlefield, the air was windless but frozen solid. Snow had layered thick over the rooftops of Norfield, a quiet little town near the northern border where people lived on firewood, potato stew, and old war stories told beside the fire. Less than 2 miles from the town's edge, a wooden bridge crossed a narrow frozen creek. That bridge led east toward a house with a weathered gray-blue roof, now overgrown with moss and faded by time. Once it belonged to Helen Callahan, a mother who used to receive handwritten letters from the front lines every month, and now sat quietly by the fire waiting for a knock that never came. Beside the bridge, a small, dark shape lay collapsed on the damp wood, curled tightly motionless, mud-caked legs, blood at the paws. A dog barely breathing, but still holding something in its teeth, something that looked like a letter. When the local authorities contacted Helen Callahan, she didn't cry. She nodded, stepped slowly onto the porch, and looked toward the wooden bridge. "You came home," she whispered. "Just not the way I hoped." That night, Shadow was given fluids and high-dose antibiotics. His body barely responded. His heartbeat was almost flat. But before the surgical lights dimmed, he stirred just slightly, turned his head toward the door where an old jacket hung on a hook, Ethan's jacket. He let out a faint growl, soft, then slipped into unconsciousness. Outside, snow began to fall again, but this time no one felt the cold, because there lay a sentinel in that small lit room, not guarding with words, but with presence, not for life, but for a promise. Once the letter's coordinates were verified, local officials escalated the case to the federal level. Within 24 hours, a special task force composed of Raven 9 veterans and independent investigators was deployed to the marked location. They needed no updated maps, no guide. They had all been there before. They fought, fell back, and lost something they'd never stopped carrying. The site lay within a narrow crevice between two cliffs, a former covert supply route for unofficial combat units. After a heavy airstrike, the area had been buried under snow and rock, and the entrance collapsed. In the official report, the site was erased. No survivors, no search needed, no bodies to recover, until a K9 returned with a letter pointing directly to it. On January 23rd, they set out crossing frozen mud and fractured terrain tires, rattling over old tracks, until GPS brought them to a barren cliffside. Nothing visible but below, where the rocky gorge narrowed like a shark's jaw, they found the remnants of an old tunnel door sealed shut under tons of rubble. It took 2 hours to clear a path wide enough to squeeze through. No one spoke as they entered. They only lowered their heads. Floodlights swept the chamber. The beam passed torn uniforms, scraps of camouflage, the broken halves of a rifle, and then stopped. At the end of the tunnel, near the collapsed dirt wall, a human figure lay on his side body, curled slightly, but still locked in a defensive stance. His right hand still gripped the stock of his rifle. The chest plate remained intact, torn only on the left, where the bullet from the ambush had pierced through. The dog tag glinted under the light, swaying gently in the draft, Ethan Callahan. But what left everyone silent wasn't the body. It was what lay beside him like a quiet punctuation at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. An old K9 collar, rusted and worn, still etched with fading letters, Shadow. K9 Unit 093, return only to Ethan. The young soldier had fallen here. And at some moment after Shadow had removed his collar and left it beside his partner as a final goodbye. They didn't call it in right away. They stayed the night, setting up a small camp, just outside the mouth of the cave. A modest fire burned. No songs, no stories, but Ethan's face appeared strangely peaceful in the soft glow cast on the jagged rock. No anger, no regret, just one thing everyone could see. He hadn't died alone. The next morning, they carried Ethan's body out of the gorge. When the transport bag was sealed, one soldier, Sergeant Trask, placed Shadow's collar inside. He's not going home alone, he said. They fought together. They go home together. A small memorial was held at the old Raven 9 base where Ethan once trained. No press, no cameras, just a folded flag, a portrait, and an empty spot beside it where Shadow's collar was placed, like a silent medal. The entire old unit was there. Some stood with canes, some arrived in wheelchairs. But all stood at attention when the remembrance call sounded. Ethan Callahan's name was called thrice for the first time in 7 months. The third time, no reply came. And in a recovery center hundreds of miles away, Shadow still lay in post-op care, breathing weakly, heart barely ticking, as if he were waiting for something still unfinished. No one imagined the truth would be uncovered, not by a confession, but by a crumpled letter. And the final growl of a dog, long thought forgotten. 3 days after Ethan Callahan's remains were found and returned, Shadow died. No cries, no convulsions, just one final breath, soft as smoke from a flame burned down to its last ember. It was the night shift nurse who found him. During the morning rounds, she noticed Shadow lying exactly as before, his head resting on Ethan's neatly folded jacket at the mat's corner. But there was something unnaturally still. She placed her hand on his chest. No heartbeat, no reflex, only a faint streak of moisture. No one knew if it was saliva or a final tear trailed from his muzzle down across the fabric of the jacket. The official time of death was recorded as 3:14 a.m., but those who had known Shadow understood he had completed the mission, and he chose when to leave. There was no grand public announcement, just a quiet internal message passed between veterans and the rescue team. Shadow, K9 Unit 093, has been laid to rest. The letter has been delivered. Mission complete. The final line made many cry in silence. Sergeant Trask, the man who led the recovery, personally carried Shadow's ashes back alongside what remained of Ethan. They chose a quiet patch of hillside near the old Raven 9 base overlooking the valley, where soldiers once trained each dawn, and Ethan had stood alone the morning he first wore the uniform. A simple grave was dug beside Ethan's, no stone, no plastic flowers, only a hand-carved wooden plaque scorched with heated nails. He carried it through fire, blood, and silence, and never let go. Shadow's old collar, which he had left beside Ethan in the tunnel, was recast in steel and placed nearby. No one called it a monument. They simply called it the resting place of a guardian, not bearing a rifle, not wearing a medal, just following a single order with a heart that never betrayed it. Weeks later, Ethan's original letter was digitally restored, reprinted, and handed to Helen. She didn't ask about Shadow. She didn't need to understand how a dog could do something deemed impossible. She sat on the porch steps, held the dried letter in both hands, and whispered, "You came home. And he didn't let you come alone." That spring, two things grew beside the graves: a young oak tree and a silent patch of lavender. People began to say that anyone who passed that place would feel the need to go quiet, as if something had not been fully told. And in that silence, Shadow's final breath still lingers somewhere in the wind. No bark, no growl, just the presence of a promise kept through claws, through blood, and the very last of a life.